I'm the first one to admit I was 24 years old, and I didn't have a really good sense of what it is I wanted to do. And I had all these offers, and I wasn't at a stage in my life where I could decide, okay, I want to practice this kind of law, or I want to practice that kind of law. It's very tough when you're at that age to really, really have a good sense of what it is you want to do.
My name's Peter Sumpton, and this is the Marketing Study Lab podcast. A podcast for those that are thinking, have thought and are doing, or already have a marketing qualification. Or even if you haven't, and you just want to know that a little bit more about what good, happy marketing is. As we cover a whole host of marketing topics, I chat to some amazing guests, each one a superstar in their own niche. And if you have a burning marketing question already, or after this episode, get in touch. We'll chat it through. peter@marketingstudylab.co.uk. Or find me on LinkedIn. The link is in the show notes. If you'd like to leave a review on iTunes, this will really help others find this podcast and spread the marketing word. Now let's get on with today's episode.
No one likes to overpromise and underdeliver. And I don't think we have on this yet another special episode of Marketing Study Lab. This wasn't supposed to be a special, but as it's all about podcasting, kind of think I got caught up in the whole discussion, and that was so easy to do today because my guest was John Lim. John is an entrepreneur, no doubt. A TEDx and public speaker, podcast host, and author, which includes an adult colouring book. I kid you not. Check it out. The links are in the show notes as usual. And there's links to all good stuff in every single podcast episode. So please check them out and have a look. John is the executive producer and host of the podcast series Moving Forward, which has reached listeners in over 50 countries. John speaks to entrepreneurs, artists, and influencers. So he's the perfect person. He's in the perfect position to give us the lowdown on podcasting and why it needs to be part of everybody's comms mix. So I all think you know what I want to ask John first. Do you stay in between the lines when colouring in?
It's funny you asked that because I did actually co-author a coloring book. So I would say if I'm literally coloring, I tend to stay within the lines. But when it comes to my life, I've definitely embraced going outside of the lines. So if that answers the question.
Absolutely love that answer. It's fantastic. So when you're in the zone, you're definitely between the lines. But then there's room for creativity and away we go. Forget the lines.
Absolutely. Even in a coloring book, I've been known to doodle. So add my own little addendums and additions to it. So
too right. Absolutely love that. And so straight into it. Tell us your story. What's been this formula that's brought you to this stage of your career, amongst other things, hosting a podcast called Moving Forward?
Well, first, Peter, thank you so much for having me on your show. It's an honor to speak to you and with your audience. So my story, I call myself an expert in career wanderlust. I started out on a very, very traditional A to B path. I went to school. I was a history, political science major with the intention of going to law school. I did go to law school directly after college, took the bar exam and practiced law in the DC area, but I was not very satisfied with the actual practice of law and made some early mistakes in terms of career decisions. And in my mid-20s, I decided to step away from the law and go work for a company so I could learn a little bit more about the business side of things as I just started to develop more interest in business development. And so I worked for a Fortune 500 company and did account management, did consulting. And through there, I learned everything from sales to marketing to presentations. And I did a lot more public speaking and developed a great interest in kind of the global look at business, how we build businesses, how we connect with customers and clients, how we cultivate sales, just the whole 360 look at the business process. And then much later on, more recently in 2011, I decided in order for me to really take my business interests to the next level, it might be helpful for me to go back to school. And so I did and got my master's in business administration. And then it was towards the end of that, it was around 2014, when the company that I worked for was going through some structural changes, that I decided maybe it's time for me to branch out on my own and become an entrepreneur. And since becoming an entrepreneur, so that was the pivotal date was June of 2014. It's over 4 years now. I've done a lot of different things, from small business consulting to private labeling physical products, selling them on Amazon and eBay, to digital products like the aforementioned coloring book, and of course launching the podcast Moving Forward, which started out as an experiment because I discovered podcasts quite by accident. And for me, they were a great way to continue my education, learn from other entrepreneurs and marketers, and just hear some amazing stories, and also to stay motivated, to stay engaged. And my thought was, I know quite a few people from all the different iterations of my career, and I would love to interview them, speak with them, share some of their great stories. At the time, learning how to podcast was a bit of a mystery. I think I read, the way I describe it, Peter, I had about 50 different tabs opened up to different YouTube videos, websites, blogs, you name it. I was attending webinars and trying to piece it together. And I had a little bit of background doing some video in my one of my segue careers as an actor. And so I was able to piece it together and figure it out. But even when I launched Moving Forward, I didn't know that I would last 10 episodes. So it was what I call an experiment. I didn't connect the thread between the podcast and anything I was doing in terms of building a business or building a brand. And now the podcast is a very important part of that, obviously. But back then, it was just an experiment to see if I could do this, if I would enjoy this. Like I said, I didn't know if I would last 10 episodes.
I'd say a lot of people start podcasting like that. Yeah. And we'll get on to Moving Forward, your podcast, in a second. I'm just curious to know, I can't remember the term for it. I was listening to a Seth Godin podcast, as you do, as everybody should do, and he was mentioning something along the lines of, when you invest in something, like, say, you were saying you go to law school, it adds pressure if you feel like you're going down the wrong path, or just because you've invested time, money, and effort into it, you feel like, I've got to finish this.
Yes.
Did you find it difficult, or did you just think, no, this definitely isn't for me, I need to find something else?
It was difficult, but it was, I would say, and this may sound a little strange, but it was both difficult and not difficult. Mm-hmm. It was difficult because, yes, I definitely felt that. I definitely had the consideration that I've put a lot of time and effort into this, not even from law school, but all the way back when I was in college. I thought I wanted to go to law school, but balance that out with the fact that I have a very low threshold tolerance for doing anything that makes me miserable long term. And once I did step away, I didn't look back, whether it was working for a Fortune 500 company, which I did for over a decade, and had largely a really, really great experience doing that. And for a long time, I thought I was just going to be in the corporate world for a long time. But now as an entrepreneur, what I find, Peter, is that even though I don't do what I envisioned doing when I graduated law school, what I've learned through that experience in the legal profession, it comes into things that I do every day, things that I touch every day. So every experience, whether or not it's something that ended up being my final career, has benefited me, even law, which I only did for a couple of years. It's something that I still find beneficial in terms of entering into business relationships, partnerships, and things like that. So I have no regrets. And I'm the type of person where I try to look at every experience as an asset. Mm-hmm. It can be it could be an expensive one. It could be one that had a lot of bumps in the road, such as my early experience practicing law. But overall, it's definitely helped shape and influence a lot of the things that I'm doing today.
Great. So moving back to your podcast, can you explain what Moving Forward, which is the title, is all about?
Yes, yeah. So great question, Peter. When I started the podcast, wanted to. I was in a position where I just left my job. I was starting a business, and really every day was it was different. It was the transition of going from a predictable schedule, a predictable paycheck, to all of a sudden, you're kind of on your own, and I wanted to really make sure that I was keeping myself in check with the right people, with the right inspiration, but also with the right continuing knowledge, so that I could build what I was starting, and really make sure that that I would be able to move forward. I mean, and I use that phrase several times when I was just kind of mapping out or envisioning what it is I wanted to do with my life and post corporate world. And and at some point, I think before I recorded my first interview, I was brainstorming, and the phrase "moving forward" just kept coming up, and really that became the genesis of what the show was. Those interviews were about: what difficulties and challenges have you faced, and what has kept you moving forward, or what are some ways that you move forward today. And so that first year, and I tried to make every year of the podcast different. The first year was focusing on what is your passion and what are some of the biggest challenges that you face. So it was very grand, broad questions I was asking. The second year, I started to get more granular, talking about things such as what are some tech tools, what are some mindset hacks, what are some practices that really facilitate you moving towards that goal. And each year I've iterated and really, really tried to dig down into very specific questions. This year, one of the questions that I ask my guests is, what is a practice or habit that you have that is completely counter to what a lot of other people do, but works really well for you? So the idea, the concept of moving forward, it's a very big concept. But as I've gotten into the podcast with each season, I've been able to dig into a very specific aspect of it. And really, Peter, what it comes down to is that when I started the podcast, when I left my job, it was during a period where the morale was pretty low in the department I worked at. About 40% of the department had just been laid off and were downsized. And so a lot of my colleagues were feeling very disheartened. And I made the decision to leave that world, to leave that safety net, if you can call it a safety net. And I know that a lot of my colleagues were struggling, still trying to figure out, well, do I ride it out, take the risk that maybe I'll be laid off next year, or is there anything else I can do? And so the whole concept of moving forward is I always pretend that I'm speaking to some of my former colleagues or even current colleagues from that world, who may be struggling, who may just not realize that with all of their experiences, skills, and talents. And you talked earlier about leaving something behind that you've put a lot of time and investment into, such as starting out as a lawyer. Many of my former colleagues were attorneys. And so I feel like that my audience, I'm speaking to people who were just like me, maybe figuring out or trying to figure out what it is they can do outside of what they're doing currently that may not be giving them a whole lot of satisfaction. So that's really the genesis of moving forward. It's a very big title. It's a very big concept, but through that, I've been able to learn from amazing people who've really facilitated my moving forward. And I've heard from listeners who have said that it's inspired them to do the same, which to me is extremely gratifying and humbling.
I can imagine just hearing that off one person just would give you the impetus to just keep on doing it. And for that one person that's spoken out, I bet there's tens, hundreds of other people that feel the same. They just haven't said that, which must be a great feeling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've had what some might call a varied career, which I think links quite nicely to moving forward and the way you do that and present that and the different topics. So you've, as you described at the very start, you've moved from acting, you've been with a Fortune 500 company, you've done TEDx talk, now podcasting. Mm-hmm. How do you know when you found your thing?
I'm so glad you asked that, Peter. And actually, when I was invited, it was about a year ago that I was invited to give my TEDx talk, and I had two reactions to getting that invitation. My first reaction was, well, this has been on my bucket list for years. I can check that off. I would love to do this. My second thought was, what the heck am I going to talk about? Wait a minute, this came way too soon because I haven't figured out what it is I'm going to be when I grow up, because I've gone through, as you've mentioned, I mean, I think you use a very, very kind of, you marketed that very well. Varied career. I call it career wanderlust. I've been all over the map, Peter.
Yeah.
And for me, it's been, a lot of it's been just, I feel like I'm a scientist in a laboratory, just trying so many different things, trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. And so I really dug into that question. In fact, I decided, instead of avoiding that question and trying to put forth a TEDx talk, which I felt would be a mask of someone who has figured out what they want to do, I went the other way. I decided, you know what? I'm going to embrace the fact that I'm not really comfortable giving a TEDx talk at this stage of my life, because I feel like this invitation should have come 5 years from now. And really, I dug into that. And what I discovered, and I went back to my podcast. In fact, I talked about the podcast in the TEDx talk, and I really wanted to highlight some of the amazing people that I've gotten to talk with on the show. And interestingly, the five people who I showcased, who I talked about in the TEDx, are people who weren't that different for me. I mean, they do very different things, but their journey was very similar in that they have done so many different things leading up to what they're doing now. But I also realized that they are continuing to evolve. And in fact, since that TEDx, which was earlier this year, some of the people that I've highlighted have actually moved on to the next iteration of their career. And so it kind of forced me to look at this in a philosophical way. And I really believe that it's not about finding one thing. It's not about, okay, I figured out what I'm going to be. I'm just going to sit on top of the mountain and just put my life on cruise control. Nowadays, especially with the way the economy is, with the access, so much easier access and lower barriers to start a business, you have more opportunities to explore, I feel like. And that's not to say that those of you who know, I want to be a doctor, I'm going to spend my entire career being a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer, that there's anything wrong with that. But for many of us, myself, as I've become more comfortable with and admitting, my life didn't unfold that way. In fact, it was very, very disheartening at points for me to say, okay, I'm going to leave the legal profession behind because I'm not happy, but I'm going to try something else. And with each iteration, whether it's working in corporate America, being an actor on film and television, and now being an entrepreneur, I've embraced the fact that I'm evolving. I think it's what keeps us vibrant. It's what keeps us alive. And it's a lesson that I got from a lot of my professors in business school who were also entrepreneurs, that you may have several businesses as an entrepreneur. And one of the most important lessons that I learned, and it's finally really started to sink in with some of my more recent guests who have talked about this, is have an exit strategy. You may start a business, you may start a project, but that business will have a cycle and you may have an exit strategy, whether it is to grow that business, to scale it, or to sell that business. And once you have that exit, even if you make, let's say, a pile of money, and I've interviewed guests who have sold businesses and they've made millions of dollars, but they continue going. They continue to the next challenge, to the next project. And I'll tell you, Peter, my dad is a great example. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's in his early 70s, and he's definitely on his second wind.
Brilliant.
Because he continues every day to work on his business, and he's continuing to evolve. And I use that as kind of my model, because I really believe life isn't about just finding one thing. Okay, I figured it out. I check it off the list. I'm on autopilot until I retire and collect a pension. No, being alive means you're exploring, you're growing. And so for me, I don't know that finding one thing is so much the goal anymore. It's just making sure that what I'm doing now is something that brings me joy, is something that is of service and of benefit to others. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I've kind of come to peace with the idea that I may never find the quote unquote one thing.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think a couple of things there that you said that the barriers to entry are now low. So without stealing Gary Vaynerchuk's phrase, you should taste everything,
Yeah,
particularly when you're younger.
absolutely. And I know that Gary Vee has some great videos on this for college students. And I know probably a lot of your audience are maybe students who are studying marketing. And one of the lessons that he shares, which I really, really believe, is that when you're in your 20s, you're too young to know what it is you want to do. You really should taste everything. And if I had to do my 20s over, it's probably the one change I would have made, is that I went from college straight into law school. By the time I graduated law school, I'm the first one to admit I was 24 years old, and I didn't have a really good sense of what it is I wanted to do. And I had all these offers, and I wasn't at a stage in my life where I could decide, okay, I want to practice this kind of law, or I want to practice that kind of law. It's very tough when you're at that age to really, really have a good sense of what it is you want to do. And we now live in an era in this year, as we're speaking, 2018, where it's not unusual for people to go through several different iterations of their career. And I think that's a healthy thing.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think exploring and growing, investing time in things, and then if it doesn't work, moving on like you've done yourself is a powerful thing. And especially the generation that's coming up now have got massive opportunities to do that.
Sure.
Where previously, or even their parents, they might not see it like that. And it's people like yourself that need to hear these types of stories and realize that they can do it, and they don't have to listen to what once was. Because if we listen to what once was, we'd all still be working in factories. And
well, yeah. And in fact, I think you raise a great point, because the model that was prevalent in the 70s and 80s of working for a corporation, getting I mean, that was the goal. You go to school, you get a job with a big company, they take care of you, you work until your retirement, and then you have your pension, your 401k. It's not really the model that exists anymore. Less and less you're finding people who are able to stay with one company. Companies fold, they merge, they downsize. That's the new reality. There isn't the type of security that there was in decades past. And I think the circumstances and the environment is the flip side to what you were saying with the opportunities. It's two sides of the same coin. We're now in an environment where you have to be more nimble. You have to be able to take more risks. You have to be able to develop more skill sets to be marketable, whether you are pursuing a traditional career or you're starting a business.
I remember hearing off my dad, and when I was must have been about 10 years ago, and I was on to my third role in a different organisation.
Mm-hmm.
So it must have been third role in, say, 9 years or something like that. And I remember him saying, I wish he'd just settle down into a role. I wish he'd just find that role. Hopefully this one will be the one that he sticks at. And I'm thinking, particularly in marketing, particularly that profession, it's just, no, that isn't what you need to be doing. For some people, fantastic. And if they find that passion in a particular organisation or whatever, great. But again, just because you're moving on, it doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. Far from it.
Oh, also, and let's talk about marketing, because I went to business school, and even in 2011, marketing is one of those fields that constantly evolves. So what I learned in business school in 2011, which really wasn't all that many years ago, is so different than what marketing looks like today. So even if you decide I want to go into marketing, you really do have to keep up, because it changes so rapidly, especially in the digital age that we're in now. I mean, the traditional marketing principles may still be sound, but the way it looks in a digital world will be so different than what it looks like in a print or TV world.
So let's move on to communication, and I want to get stuck into some value in terms of comms channels, and provide some of the students and listeners with a little bit more background and in-depth knowledge from this point of view and expertise. So looking at specifically podcasting, first of all, why do you enjoy it so much? And I could probably answer that for you. But what makes it such an engaging channel?
Okay, so let's start with the first question. Why do I enjoy it? I'll list off a couple of key reasons why I think podcasting is so enjoyable, and it's something that I encourage a lot of people to consider. Is number one, I love to learn, and that's kind of my thing, is that if I'm learning something from somebody, especially if they have a different experience, if they have a different field, it really, really lights me up to be able to learn something new. And so for me, podcasting, I'll tell you, Peter, and I tell people this all the time, podcasting is one of the biggest cost-saving hacks for continuing your education. You want to talk to someone who is an expert in marketing, or an expert in business or finance, and get half an hour of their time and not pay them tens of thousands of dollars to do so. Invite them to be a guest on your podcast, because
Sure.
you're going to get their time, where normally I've spoken with people who charge a tremendous amount of money for their time, but I get to speak with them one-on-one, ask them questions just like you're doing today, and really learn from them, and then share that with an audience. There's something very empowering about that. Your podcast can be, whether you do an interview podcast, you'll have an opportunity to learn from people, or if you're doing a solo podcast, and I've spoken with a lot of students since I do go back to my business school alma mater to give speeches and presentations. I encourage people, do start some sort of content, whether it's a podcast, a vlog, or a blog, where you're documenting your learning. And I think that can be very powerful as well, is that if you're going through a journey, or if you're learning something in school, start documenting that. Because the other thing that I love about podcasting is that I just feel like you're building. And as a kid, I loved playing with Legos. And with each episode, it's one additional building block, which gets your brand out there, which also introduces you to an audience, helps with your website SEO, all of that technical stuff. But really what you're doing is you're building your own brand awareness. And that, I think, podcasting for me has been a very fluid way to do that. I just love the fact that I can speak with someone who may be the CEO of a huge company in t-shirts and jeans, So to me, it's just it's a fun way to do it, and I love the fact that it's allowed me to connect with people like you, Peter, because of the podcast. Just to kind of give the chain of events, because of the podcast, I connected with who invited me on her Facebook live show. And from there, you and I connected, and now we're speaking on your podcast. It's the ultimate relationship builder. I call it your 21st century business card is having a podcast these days, because it will help you grow in terms of what you're learning from other people, but it also enables you to share that with others and to build some amazing relationships.
Yeah, I could completely agree. Couldn't agree more. And it's speaking to people like yourself that is partly from an egotistical point of view why I do this, but mainly because I know that you're going to provide so much value to people that are listening. And again, it's just spreading that value and knowledge, which is just a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. And Peter, I know this, we live in an age where you can communicate with anyone across the globe. You are in London. I am in Washington, D.C. We're speaking on your podcast. Just 2 decades ago, this would not have been possible. Yeah. We would not have. I mean, in order for this to have been possible 2 decades ago when I was growing up, we would have to get on a very expensive long distance call, maybe use a tape recorder, and we'd have nowhere to air it. Now we have the technology, which is the cost is really minimal. To be able to connect like this, to speak as if we're in the same room, and to share this knowledge, and then to immediately blitz it out to an audience. This is an incredible age to be in.
Yeah, I totally agree. Looking at marketing and where podcasting would fit in, where is this medium fitting in from a multi-channel or omni-channel approach?
I love this question. This is, I think, a great question. And if you're a marketing student, I think this is one of the most important questions that you can look at if you're listening to podcasts, but also maybe thinking about starting one. So let's look at the inbound marketing channel. So I'll break it down very simply. So you connect with strangers, building that brand awareness. You have the developing the relationship. You have maybe cultivating the sales, closing the sales, celebrating the customer. The most obvious one would be stage one, where having a podcast is allowing you to connect with potential customers, your audience. So we call that getting to know the strangers. And what's great about a podcast as opposed to a brochure or an advertorial or even a website is that when someone listens to your podcast, they're hearing your voice, they're hearing your inflections, they're hearing your personality. It's a very, very intimate, personal way to get to know someone. You feel like you have a sense of who this person is. And the same is true with, you mentioned Gary Vee. He's a good example. So many people resonate with him because of the way he talks. His personality, his larger than life personality, they see it in his videos and they listen to it on his podcast. You're cultivating that feeling that goes from stranger to listener to I feel like I know you. From there, a percentage of those listeners, as you're building the critical mass, may want to do more. They may want to learn more from you, or they may want to engage with you more. So they may see, has this person written any books, or do they offer courses to teach what it is I want to do? Or in other words, do they have a product or service? So rather than go for a direct sales approach, I feel like the podcast is really laying a great groundwork for building a relationship, delivering value. So it's really the front end of the funnel. Now, what's interesting, Peter, is that a podcast can also be very important for the other stages of the marketing channel. So let's talk about maybe closing sales. So if you are offering a service or product, perhaps you have a listener who's now a subscriber and listening to every episode. As they're getting to know you, and the more value you're delivering to them, the more likely they may follow what's called a call to action. So as a podcaster, one of the things you might do is say, subscribe to my mail list or leave a rating and review on my podcast. Basically just a simple ask, for someone who is maybe interested to learn more. So it can be a great facilitator to cultivate a client relationship or a customer relationship. So it can really, really, again, make that listener feel comfortable in purchasing your product or service. In terms of celebrating the customer, again, a good example would be a customer who leaves rave reviews of your podcast. I know that some podcasts, they'll read out some of the comments or reviews or questions. If you have a podcast where you're using social media to directly answer a question from a listener, you are delivering specific value to that customer. So really a podcast can really be a layered facilitator for almost any part of the marketing stage, whether it's the kind of attracting your customers or listeners to actually developing sales, to celebrating the customers. And I also have heard of podcasts where they actually take their clients, let's say it's a consulting company, they're working with a small business, they'll interview that small business and use that as a model for other small businesses, also to help promote that small business. So really, a podcast is so flexible and fluid, it can really integrate into almost any stage of the marketing process.
So what's the key to a good podcast then?
Oh, great question. I would say there are really two big aspects to this. Number one, make sure, and I know this sounds very common sense, but I'm amazed at how many people who want to start a podcast miss this part. Make sure you love what you're talking about. The mistake that I've seen people make in trying to start a podcast is getting into podcasting for podcasting's sake. So I'll give you an example. I won't mention names, but someone that is a friend mentioned to me a couple of years ago, I'd love to do a podcast interviewing Lyft and Uber drivers, and I want to do a whole podcast about the driver for hire economy. And my thought was, that's great. Sounds like a great idea. She did a couple of interviews. Not one of those interviews has ever aired. And the reason is, my sense is that she thought it was a cool topic, but it wasn't a topic that got her so excited that she was anxious to put out that first episode. So you really have to love what you're talking about. And my suggestion to anyone who's thinking about a podcast is think about what you really love to talk about. If you love to talk about Game of Thrones, start a podcast about Game of Thrones. If you could talk about Game of Thrones for hours on end, dissecting it, start your podcast there. If you are interested in beekeeping, start a podcast on beekeeping. Whatever niche topic you are so passionate about that you could just talk about it, whether you hit record or not, that's probably the direction you want to go in. I don't recommend starting a podcast just because it's an interesting topic. It's a cool topic. Because if you're not really driven, because as you know, Peter, podcasting is work. There is work to this, and keeping up with those episodes takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. So you've got to make sure you love what you're talking about. Otherwise, your podcast may not last very long. And I always suggest this, and I wrote an article about this not long ago. When you start a podcast, something I did not do, which I would do today if I were starting one, is actually start with an exit strategy. Actually map out, what is my podcast going to be? How many episodes will it be? Is it going to be a short run podcast of 20 episodes, or will it be a podcast of 10 seasons? Start with the exit. And the reason why, and I know people will say, well, no, John, I love this topic so much, I could talk about it forever. I'm just going to let the podcast run. I see so many podcasts, Peter, that peter out between 12 to 20 episodes. And I think part of that is that the topic may not be engaging enough for the person to really carve out the time to do it. And secondly, they haven't really thought through, what kind of show is this? Not every podcast is meant to run forever. So if you plan an exit strategy, you have a little bit more control. You're taking the reins on when your show is going to end, as opposed to circumstances in life ending it for you. So I'd say number one, make sure you really love what you're talking about. Number two is be consistent. And that calls back to number one. Podcasting is really about building a library of content. And the other thing that a lot of people get excited about is they see famous podcasters who they'll launch their first episode, say like Oprah or Tony Robbins, they get 1 million downloads, and all of a sudden, they're thinking large numbers. Most podcasts, when they launch, because it's such a crowded field now, aren't going to get huge numbers. It's a long game. The more you stick with it, the more consistent you are with the content, the more you're going to see the needle move. The needle for a podcast doesn't hinge on one really big guest or one really big episode. It's really about having a consistent body of work that you're devoting your time and energy into. So I always recommend, come up with a schedule, stick with that schedule, come up with a format, make sure your time that you have to devote to a podcast allows you to do that. If you don't have time for a half-hour podcast, launch a 5-minute podcast. Be consistent with it, because it's a long game. It's a long-term investment. An audience it goes back to your marketing question. Developing a relationship with a potential customer takes time. It takes trust. It takes delivering value and doing so consistently. So if you're really interested in becoming a podcaster and in growing a brand, starting a business, those are all wonderful goals. Just know that it's a long game. It's not one of those things where things happen immediately, not at least with most people.
So why do so many podcasts fail then?
I think I hit on this. I'd say a lot of podcasts fail for two reasons. Number one, people choose topics that really are interesting topics, but not necessarily the topics that really drive them to want to do this every week. So start there. Make sure you're really, really picking something that really floats your boat. And I would say, if you love Game of Thrones, develop a podcast around that. I mean, because you'll be able to have such a fun time. It'll feel less like work if you really enjoy talking about the specific subject. The other reason why I think podcasts fail is for the other reason that I alluded to, is that expectations. I think a lot of people go into podcasting thinking, okay, if I expect 100,000 downloads within my first 5 episodes, and when they don't hit that, they give up very easily. And if they're not seeing the needle move, and a lot of this is perspective. So a friend of mine just launched her podcast over the summer, and it's a great show. And within her first 5 episodes, she reported back to me. She said, John, you know what? I'm only getting 500 or 600 downloads. I'm like, that's fantastic. 500, 600 downloads is fantastic. I think people get caught up looking at social media and keeping up with the Joneses, as they say. And they see big name podcasters who have 1 million downloads or 100,000 downloads. And they're using that as the benchmark for their own success. And I think that's a completely wrong way to look at it. Because if you think about it this way, Peter, think about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, how hard it would be to reach 400 or 500 people. How much money it would take to spend on an advertisement for television or radio to hit 500 people. Now you can launch a podcast and do that. It's all about perspective. And what I said to this person was, imagine you had 400 people in a room. You'd have to have a very large room to fit that many people. Those are the people that you are hitting with your podcast. It's not about quantity. It's really about quality, right? You want to have, I've said this before, I would rather have 10 really enthusiastic, engaged listeners than 100 casual listeners. So I think it's expectations that cause people to give up. And remember, the podcast needle moves very slowly. It's one of those things where you're going to see the audience grow over time. Just because it really is a long-term investment. And I think people, once they get over the hurdle of how to launch a podcast, they want to see the results right away. When it takes time to cultivate an audience, to develop a relationship with an audience.
I think one thing you were saying there throughout those answers, which is massively important, is consistency in podcasting.
Yeah.
And again, the other thing you mentioned is it is really freaking hard and it takes a lot of time. But it's the consistency that's massively important. So how do you stay organised, particularly yourself, John, amongst all the other projects you've got going on?
That's a great question, Peter. So, this actually calls back to something I wrote about on LinkedIn as well, is that one of the most important things to do when you're starting any project, whether it's a podcast, a blog, writing a book, or a business project, is to do a time audit. So we're all busy people. And if you want to do something like start a podcast, be very, very honest with yourself. Look at your schedule and do a time audit. And I recommend track where you're spending every minute and do this for a week or two. Figure out, how much time do I really have to devote to a podcast? And from there, reverse engineer what your podcast is going to look like. The problem that I see, and a lot of people end up doing this, including people that I've worked with launching podcasts, is that they will format the podcast and revolve their schedules around that rather than the other way around. So, for example, if someone looks at a podcast and they're a busy person, they say, I want to launch a podcast. It's going to be half an hour. It's going to air twice a week. I'm going to interview a whole bunch of people. They may not be very realistic about what their expectations are and how much time they have. So I recommend do a time audit first. And then from there, format a podcast that's going to work within that time frame. So for example, let's say I'm a busy professional. I travel every week, and maybe I only have at most half an hour a week. Well, I'm not going to create an hour-long podcast or 2 half-hour-long week podcasts if I only have half an hour to devote. I may do a much shorter podcast. I may do a 15-minute podcast. I may do a 5-minute podcast. Format the show around your time constraints. And then from there, plan ahead. So let's say I only have an hour a month. I don't even have an hour a week. I have an hour a month that I could devote to doing a podcast. Well, great. What I might do then is I might do a 5-minute weekly podcast, pre-record all those episodes ahead of time. So, about four weeks in a month, 5 episodes, 4 or 5 episodes, each 5 minutes. I'll plan them ahead of time, schedule them out. And that's really what it takes to do consistent content, is really just plan ahead. So with moving forward, what I do is I record interviews. Since it's not a real-time or current events podcast, I record those interviews, and they usually trickle out between 1 to 2 months ahead of schedule. So I preload and pre-schedule that. In fact, it's funny you mentioned this. I just wrote an article today about planning a podcast for the holidays. So we have the holiday season coming up. And for podcasters, a lot of podcasters may be thinking about, well, what do I want to do for the holidays? My suggestion is start planning that holiday episode now. Don't wait till December, when you're hectic with the holiday season, you've got friends, family, you've got your end of business stuff. Plan your podcast now to air in December. So plan ahead. I mean, that's the benefit of doing a podcast, is that you can format it so that you can really, really plan ahead with those episodes. Map it out. I use a spreadsheet where my show airs every Tuesday. So for each year, I mark out every Tuesday for that particular year, and I plan about 1 to 3 months ahead of schedule. And that's how I'm able to balance it. Because if you plan ahead, you're going to find that you're able to build in the time to record the episodes, schedule them out, and then those months you'll continue to release new content while you're able to work on other things. So it's really, really just comes down to being honest with yourself and doing a time audit and planning ahead.
Yeah, I've just been quiet here, jotting all these notes down and learning from them. Absolute gold dust, fantastic stuff. Just out of interest, have you noticed, because this podcast comes out on a Tuesday as well, have you noticed what days of the week Christmas Day and New Year's Day land on?
Yeah, I in fact, it's so funny because I wrote about that too. So think about, and it's entirely up to the content. And one of the things that I stressed was it's entirely up to the content creator whether or not they want to acknowledge the holidays or not. So some podcasts, they'll do a whole episode devoted to the holidays. Others will just, continue to air episodes, just regular episodes, but do be mindful of which day the holiday falls on. So like you said, your podcast airs on a Tuesday, mine comes out on a Tuesday. So what I do is I look to see which day that particular holiday falls on. So if it's Christmas or New Year's, does it fall on a Tuesday? Do I want an episode to air that day? And you may want to actually shift that episode a day before or a day ahead. It really depends on what the episode is. If it's holiday specific, it might be fine. If it's an interview, I'd probably maybe think about shifting it, because you're probably not going to get as many listeners on a holiday. So it really just plan ahead. And that's why I recommend doing a content calendar where you're seeing where the Tuesday falls in a given month.
You being organized is massively important for any podcaster, and I think it's the same when you're doing any type of studying as well. You need to be organized, which it's great because people listening can transfer what you're saying into either podcasting if they want to try that, or their studies. But another thing that's important in podcasting, or I feel, is coming across, at least if you have confidence. Mm-hmm. Especially when you're putting yourself out there in podcasting or on social or wherever. And I think it can be the same when answering questions. Some people might not have that confidence. Any tips on building that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Peter. I'm going to say a couple things about building confidence. Number one, it comes with practice. The more you do this, the better at it you'll get. Be comfortable with the fact that your first episodes, if you do a podcast and you've never done one before, your first episodes may be a little raw. Be okay with that. I think podcasts are, if anything, a documentation of how you grow and improve over time. And almost every podcast that I've listened to, the people that stick with it, their current episodes are so leaps and bounds far ahead of their first episodes, mine included. So be okay with the fact that you're not going to be perfect at launch. In terms of just more practical tips, I think one that's really, really good, and I also recommend this for public speaking, is when you hit that record button, before you even ask your guest the first question or before you do the introduction, take a deep breath. Just take a pause, take a breath. And because when you are engaging with someone in a conversation, especially someone you've never spoken with before, or speaking to an audience for the first time, you're feeling the urgency that I have to say something and it has to be good. You're essentially giving up your power, your authority to your nerves. If you take a deep breath, take a pause before you even say your first word, you're recapturing some of that power. You're recapturing some of that essence, and you are basically saying to yourself, to your audience, to the universe, to what have you, I'm going to take my time. I'm going to take a breath. Oxygen's important, breathe, and I'm going to settle and calm my nerves. I'm going to relax. And then I'm going to ask my first question, where I'm going to say my first statement. Breathing is extremely important, because what happens is when you go into panic mode, or when your adrenaline starts rushing, or when you're nervous, where you're suffering from stage fright, what's happening is that your respiratory system starts to constrict and you're not getting enough oxygen. So taking a deep breath can be extremely, extremely helpful for calming your nerves. And I recommend this as well. Don't be afraid to take a breath before your next statement. So in between statements, or before you ask a question or before you answer a question, take a breath. It's one of those things that can really help calm your mind, because your mind is probably racing at 20 miles a minute. Taking a breath will help you calm down a little bit. There are other things that can help as well. I think for confidence, I mean, if you're doing a podcast and you're nervous, just to maybe take 5 minutes to meditate before you even hop on the interview. Just shut off all the electronic devices, sit in a corner, just breathe, close your eyes, try to relax. And I think confidence really comes from just having the right frame of mind and breathing. I think those are both very important things.
There's no time to be quiet, calm now, because we're going to enter some quick fire questions, if that's okay, John. So no pressure here.
You got it. Happy to do it.
Brilliant. I hope you meditated before this, because
I did.
Let's go for it. Name one must-read business book.
Principles by Ray Dalio.
What was the last thing you Googled?
Charlie Brown quotes.
Oh, brilliant. I've got to ask why.
Because, on Twitter, I actually, it's my last tweet of the day. Every day I tweet out a quote, usually an inspirational quote from an author, an entrepreneur, or it could be a composer. Lately, I've gotten into Charlie Brown quotes. I'm not sure why. I'm tapping into my childhood. So I just found one that I'm tweeting out tomorrow evening, actually.
I love it. What is your most used app at the moment?
Okay, so great question. There are three. So the native one would definitely be text messaging, but outside of that, two that I really love is Goodreads, which is basically, it's kind of a book reading app where you're keeping track of your books, but it's also a social media tool where you can connect with friends and see what they're reading, send each other recommendations. I love it. Cool. I'm an avid reader. I try to read a book a week, so Goodreads is a great one. And the other app that I really love is Elevate. It's just kind of like mind exercises, puzzles, math, speaking, listening. They're just quick exercises. I do them every morning, usually when I'm on the bicycle at the gym in the morning. So Elevate.
What is your favorite theory, concept, or methodology?
Okay, and this kind of calls back to what we were talking about earlier about confidence, but another book that I really loved this year that I read was Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. And one of the things he talks about is the 10,000 hour rule. And he looked at very successful people, from Bill Gates to other entrepreneurs and people who are successful in their fields. And the one commonality that I think he dissects or extracts is that they all started, with hour one and built on that. And I really subscribe to the theory that the more you do something, the better at it you'll get. Podcasting is a great example. As I said before, your first episode may be raw. Your first couple of interviews may not be your best, but keep at it. Consistency will keep you on that track. The more you approach the 10,000 hour mark or build towards it, the better at something you're going to get.
Final quickfire question. This might be a little bit of a long one because I think there's a difference between US and UK here, but podcasting or NPR, which is National Public Radio, or just radio in this country?
No, NPR. It's funny. I've got a story about this.
Okay.
So I got into podcasting because I couldn't get a signal on the NPR app. That's my story. I was at the gym. I was trying to get on the NPR app. I couldn't get a signal. That's when I discovered the podcast app. And the story that I tell is that I listened to Jack Spear, who's one of the anchors for NPR, the DC affiliate of NPR. And he's someone that I listen to. He does a lot of business news and current events. And so the joke is that I probably would have listened to Jack Spear that day, but I ended up listening to podcasts instead. fast forward to this year's TEDx speech. I actually shared the stage with Jack Spear, got to know him, and invited him to come on my podcast. So it kind of came full circle. So I would say, Peter, I love both, but definitely more of a podcast listener these days. I still listen to NPR, but I definitely lean more heavy towards podcasts.
When it's meant to be, it's meant to be. And I think in that scenario, it's definitely meant to be.
Definitely.
That's a great way to finish, John. Pleasure talking to you. But final thing, if people want to find more or find more out about Moving On, your podcast, or get in touch with you, where should they go?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for asking. Most of my social media handles are at @BMovingForward, including on Twitter. If you want to follow me on Instagram, I use an old handle, jlim0025, and the website is bmovingforward.com.
John, again, an absolute pleasure talking to you today. I think it's could ramble on about podcasts all day for me personally. So it's been a bit of definitely a labour of love, but I suppose this podcast for me always is, but this one especially. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, no, Peter, I want to say thank you so much.
So it's time to run through a couple of takeaways from that very self-indulgent, from my part anyway, podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Podcasting can be a powerful tool as it allows you to learn and share. If it wasn't for the power of the podcast, I wouldn't have had the pleasure of talking to John at all, and you wouldn't have the honour of listening to him. Podcasting can also help with brand awareness in many different ways. It can provide proof of knowledge, status, culture, beliefs, word of mouth, passive listening, credibility, and also that all-important awareness that we spoke about a second ago. Podcasting can fit into your comms mix at any stage of the customer journey. It's so versatile. It can connect you to strangers that may have never heard of you at the top of the sales funnel, and through engaging and developing relationships during the middle, through know, like, and trust, right through to cultivating the customer by providing a call to action in a non-intrusive way. They are completely versatile. And remember, the key to a good podcast is to make sure the topic is something you love talking about. I love talking about marketing, and that is why I've started this. Most podcasts don't get past 20 or 30 episodes, and I think to date we're about 25, 26, so fingers crossed we're nearly at that threshold. So you need to plan it out if you're going to start one. Make sure you can be consistent, and most importantly, loving it. And here's a little additional takeaway or top tip, as John was so gracious enough to share how to maximize your time when you feel you are mega busy and you can't fit any more into your day, which I'm pretty sure is kind of standard for most people these days. All you have to do in the first instance is do a time audit of every single part of your day. Do this for a week or two, and then look back at this time audit to see how much time you're apportioning to every element of your life. And is this time that you're apportioning being used wisely? In doing this, you'll start to see the gaps where time is spent inefficiently, and how much time you can devote to podcasting, or in this case, your studies. Then plan ahead. Get a plan and map out your studies. Thank you so much for joining us today on Marketing Study Lab. It really means the world that you're listening to this out there, and hopefully I've provided you some value. If you're looking to know more about what Marketing Study Lab does and is about, go to marketingstudylab.co.uk or get in touch with me personally, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or feel free to email me at peter@marketingstudylab.co.uk. Happy marketing.